March 6, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. The oxygen mask froze against Major Hans Kogler's face as he scanned the crystalline sky through his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6's canopy, leading his mixed formation of fighters toward the bomber stream his ground controllers had promised would be unescorted at this altitude, this deep into the Reich. Achtung! Indianer at 12 o'clock high, single-engine fighters with drop tanks. The warning crackled through his headset in growing panic. Kogler's blood turned to ice water. American fighters. Single-engine fighters. Here, over Brandenburg. Less than 50 miles from Berlin. It was impossible. No Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to penetrate this far into Germany and return to England. The maximum escort range of the American P-47 Thunderbolt was Aachen, barely scratching German airspace. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could reach Hanover on a good day, but Brandenburg? Berlin itself. This shattered every calculation, every assumption, every defensive strategy the Luftwaffe had built since the American daylight bombing campaign began. As Kogler watched the glinting silver shapes grow larger, their distinctive squared wingtips and sleek profiles becoming unmistakable, he understood with crystalline clarity that he was witnessing the beginning of the end. These were not the stubby thunderbolts or twin-boomed lightnings they had learned to engage at the extreme edge of their range. These were North American P-51B Mustangs, and they moved through the sky with the easy confidence of predators who knew they had fuel to burn, altitude to spare, and all the time in the world to hunt. 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were approaching Berlin, not the usual feint toward the capital before turning to secondary targets, but a direct assault on the heart of the Third Reich. And for the first time in the history of aerial warfare, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way there and all the way back. What Kogler and his formation of 7 twin-engine Me-110s and 41 Me-109s did not know was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological collapse in the history of military aviation, a complete destruction not just of aircraft and pilots, but of the very belief system that had sustained German air superiority since 1939. The mathematics of annihilation were being written not in the conference rooms of the Air Ministry, but in the contrails streaking across the Brandenburg sky at Angels 28. The shock had actually begun building weeks before, though few in the Luftwaffe High Command had connected the dots. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf, commanding JG-11, had encountered American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than they should have been able to fly. His after-action report, suggesting these fighters must have refueled at secret bases in Sweden, was dismissed by Berlin as combat fatigue affecting judgment. But the sightings multiplied. Hanover on January 29th, Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each report pushed the known envelope of American fighter range further east, and each was met with official denial. The Reich Air Ministry issued a directive on February 15th stating categorically that reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr are misidentifications of twin-engine P-38s or friendly aircraft. Pilots making such claims will be subject to medical evaluation. The truth was far more disturbing than Swedish conspiracies or pilot hallucinations. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had achieved what German technical experts had declared physically impossible, extending the P-51B Mustang's combat radius to over 650 miles using expendable auxiliary fuel tanks. The mathematics seemed to violate the basic laws of aerodynamics. A single-engine fighter carrying enough fuel to fly 1,300 miles while maintaining combat performance was, according to German calculations, an engineering impossibility. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, who commanded 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary in early 1944, "We had calculated precisely. The American single-engine fighters could escort their bombers 280 miles from their bases in England. no further. This gave us all of central and eastern Germany as a hunting ground where we could attack the bomber streams without interference. It was simple arithmetic. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals range. The Americans could not change the laws of physics. But the Americans had not changed the laws of physics. They had simply applied them more creatively than anyone in the German High Command had imagined possible. The secret lay not in the aircraft itself, but in two revolutionary innovations that German intelligence had either missed or dismissed as propaganda: the Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-designed paper drop tanks. The Packard 5-1650-3 engine in the P-51B was not merely a licensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, it was an improved version, manufactured to tolerances that exceeded even the original British specifications. Using American mass production techniques refined in Detroit's automotive plants, Packard had achieved something remarkable: an engine that produced 1,490 horsepower at sea level, and, crucially, maintained over 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet, thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, a technical specialist with JG-26, examined a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944. His report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives after the war, reveals the German amazement. The engine installation is a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. The intercooler system alone is more sophisticated than anything in our Daimler-Benz 605. But most remarkable is the production quality. Every component is machined to jeweler's precision, yet they tell us the Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. If true, this is not a war of pilots, but of production lines. The drop tanks represented an even more elegant solution. Constructed from pressed paper impregnated with plastic resin, these 108-gallon auxiliary tanks weighed just 35 pounds empty, lighter than the ammunition for one of the Mustang's machine guns. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had developed the laminated craft paper construction method, which could hold fuel for approximately 5 hours before beginning to break down. This was more than sufficient for the 2.5-hour flight to Berlin. German engineers had experimented with auxiliary tanks, but their approach reflected a fundamental philosophical difference. The German tanks were metal, reusable, expensive, and heavy. They degraded performance so severely that fighters carrying them were vulnerable to attack. The American paper tanks were cheap, disposable, and light. A P-51B with 2 108-gallon drop tanks could fly to Berlin, jettison the tanks in seconds when entering combat, and fight with full performance. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, explained the tactical revolution in a 1944 briefing. The Germans expected us to husband our fuel, to save enough for combat and return. But with drop tanks, we could burn fuel like millionaires. Cruise to Berlin on the external tanks, drop them, and still have our full internal fuel load for 30 minutes of combat at full throttle, plus the flight home. We weren't flying on the edge anymore. We had margin to burn. To understand the psychological impact of March 6, 1944, one must first understand the trauma of October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, when the 8th Air Force had attempted to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range fighter escort. Of 291 B-17 flying fortresses that crossed into German airspace that day, 60 were shot down and 138 damaged, a loss rate of 20.6% with casualties of over 600 airmen. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated with brutal efficiency that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, was forced to suspend deep penetration raids entirely. General Major Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighters, declared October 14th the greatest victory of the Jagdwaffe in the defensive war. In his post-war memoir, The First and the Last, he wrote, "After Schweinfurt, we believed we had proven that daylight precision bombing was a failed concept. The Americans would have to join the British in night bombing, where accuracy was impossible and damage limited. We had won the theoretical battle. But Galland, brilliant tactician though he was, had made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed the Americans would accept the limitations of existing technology rather than developing new solutions. When reports of a new American fighter with extraordinary range began reaching his desk in December 1943, he dismissed them. When his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of seeing things. It was not until February 20th, 1944, the opening day of Big Week, that Galland began to grasp the magnitude of the threat. The Americans launched 1,000 bombers with 835 fighter escorts, including the first large-scale deployment of P-51Bs. Over the next 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and, more critically, 100 experienced pilots, 17% of their available veteran fighter force. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, Adolf's younger brother, commanding 3 JG-26, reported after Big Week. The appearance of Mustangs changed everything. Before, we could position ourselves beyond fighter range and attack the bombers methodically. Now we had to fight our way through escorts just to reach the bombers, then fight our way out. Every mission became a battle for survival from takeoff to landing. The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned clear and cold across northern Europe. Perfect flying weather. At RAF Leiston in England, ground crews had been working through the night, preparing the 357th Fighter Group for the most ambitious mission yet attempted, the first P-51 unit to provide escort all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer, commanding the 357th Fighter Group, briefed his pilots at 0600 hours. "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B, the entire distance. We'll be over enemy territory for 4 hours. Any man who doesn't think his aircraft is in perfect condition should abort now. There will be no second chances at these distances." No one aborted. However, Colonel Spicer himself would abort shortly after takeoff with mechanical problems, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes to assume command of the historic mission. At 0830, 730 heavy bombers began lifting off from bases across East Anglia. Behind them, 796 fighters prepared to provide relay escort, P-47s for the initial penetration, P-38s for the middle phase, and P-51 Mustangs for the deepest penetration and target escort. The 357th Fighter Group launched 48 P-51Bs, though only 33 would successfully reach Berlin after mechanical issues and navigation challenges in heavy cloud cover. In Germany, the Reichsjagdführung, Reich Air Defense radar stations, began picking up the massive formation as it assembled over the North Sea. The plotters at Doberitz, the primary fighter control centre for Berlin's defence, initially assessed this as another feint. The Americans had approached Berlin before, but always turned away to hit targets in Western Germany. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commanding the 2nd Fighter Division responsible for Berlin's defence, studied the plot and made a fateful decision. He would hold his fighters on the ground until the bombers committed to their target. No point in wasting fuel if this was another deception. At 11:30 hours, the lead bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem. The escorting P-47s engaged German fighters rising from bases in Holland and Western Germany. Everything proceeded according to the established pattern. The Luftwaffe pilots engaged cautiously, waiting for the moment they knew must come, when the American escorts reached their fuel limits and turned back. At 12:55 hours, as the bomber stream approached Berlin, Major Hans Kogler led his mixed formation to intercept what they believed would be unescorted bombers. His force consisted of 7 Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters that had been pressed into day service, along with 41 single-engine Bf-109. German controllers had tracked the P-47s turning back and assumed the bombers were now vulnerable. Major Thomas Hayes, leading the 357th Fighter Group's 33 Mustangs that had reached Berlin through difficult weather, later described the moment in his combat report. We broke through the cloud layer to see B-24 Liberators below and to our left. Simultaneously, we spotted approximately 40 enemy aircraft positioning for attack, Me 100s and 10s and Me 100s and 9s. They hadn't seen us yet. We had altitude advantage and complete surprise. The German formation, focused entirely on the bomber stream, never saw the Mustangs until it was too late. Hayes dove on the enemy fighters, calling out, "Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock low. Drop tanks and attack." Feldwebel Johann Müller of JG-11, flying one of the escorting Bf-109S, survived the encounter and later described it. "We were in perfect position, just beginning our attack dive on the bombers when tracers flashed past my canopy. I looked up to see single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us from above. It was impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was that these must be captured aircraft, some kind of deception. But then I saw the drop tanks falling away, dozens of them, and I knew these were real American fighters with range we hadn't imagined possible. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. The German fighters, caught completely by surprise and out of position, scattered in confusion. In 12 minutes of combat, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down a Bf-109 at low level near Welsen, then led other Mustangs in strafing a German airfield. At his estate at Karinhall, 50 miles north of Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was having lunch when the call came through from General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland. American fighters were over Berlin, single-engine fighters. "You're mistaken, Galland," Göring said flatly. "Check your reports again." "Herr Reichsmarschall, I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this moment." Göring's rage was volcanic. According to his aide, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, who was present, the Reichsmarschall threw his wine glass against the wall and screamed, "This is treason! Sabotage! The pilots are lying to cover their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed." But even as Göring raged, the evidence was undeniable. From his own estate he could see the contrails over Berlin, hear the distant thunder of aircraft engines at full power. His aide would later testify that Göring stood at the window for nearly an hour, watching the sky, saying nothing. That evening, Göring issued his most infamous order of the air war. Any pilot who claims to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin is to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The maximum range of American fighters is the Ruhr. This is a scientific fact. The order created chaos in fighter units already reeling from their losses. Pilots who had just survived combat against P-51s were now being threatened with court-martial for reporting what they had seen. Several squadron commanders, including Major Günther Rall, simply ignored the order and told their pilots to report twin-engine fighters in their combat reports. General Major Galland, in a heated conference at the Air Ministry on March 8th, presented Göring with a piece of a P-51's drop tank, clearly stamped, "Made in USA," and recovered from a field near Magdeburg. Göring's response entered Luftwaffe legend. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible." It was at this point, according to Galland's memoirs, that he knew Germany had lost the war. Later, at Nuremberg, Göring would admit, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented not just a tactical surprise, but an existential crisis. These were men who had been told repeatedly that they were defending an impregnable fortress, that German science and engineering were superior to anything the Allies could produce. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, commanding 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. We had always known where we were safe, where we could reform, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital. The psychological impact was amplified by the quality of the opposition. The P-51B was not merely present over Berlin, it was dominant. Its Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, faster than the Bf 109 G6's 386 miles per hour at the same altitude. Its laminar flow wing provided exceptional high-altitude handling. Its 4.50 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower, and most crucially, its pilots were fresh, not fatigued from hours of combat at the edge of their fuel reserves. Unteroffizier Werner Preuss of JG 301 survived an encounter with P-51s on March 9th and described the experience. They came from above and behind, always with altitude advantage. When we turned to engage, they would climb away. They had the power to go vertical whenever they chose. When we tried to dive away, they followed easily. They fought like they had unlimited fuel, making multiple passes, following us down to low altitude. We were used to American fighters that had to watch their fuel, that would make one pass and continue home. These Mustangs played with us like cats with mice. Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG 77, would later write about the strategic shift. We had to assume every bomber formation had Mustang escort, even if we couldn't see them. No more large formation attacks. No more taking time to position ourselves. We had to go in immediately with whatever we had, accept higher losses, and hope to get through to the bombers before the Mustangs found us. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin coincided with, and accelerated, another crisis that was slowly strangling the Luftwaffe. Fuel shortage. Germany had always been dependent on synthetic fuel production, converting coal to aviation gasoline through the Burgess hydrogenation process. This required massive industrial plants that were vulnerable to precision bombing. Before March 1944, these synthetic fuel plants had been largely immune from attack. They were too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter escort. The mathematics were simple. Without escort, bombers couldn't survive over the target long enough for precision bombing. Without precision, the massive concrete structures of the hydrogenation plants were unlikely to be seriously damaged. The Mustang changed this equation overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major attack against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers, escorted by 735 fighters, including 298 P-51s, delivered 1,718 tons of bombs with unprecedented accuracy. Production at Luna dropped 90% overnight. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen from 175,000 tons per month to 35,000 tons. By September, it was down to 7,000 tons, barely enough to fuel 500 sorties per day across all fronts. Training flights were cancelled entirely. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 50 hours total flight time, compared to the 250 hours that had been standard in 1942. A veteran pilot who had transferred from the Eastern Front to Reich Defense described the deteriorating situation. By summer 1944, we were limited to one training flight per week, then one per month, then none at all. New pilots arrived at our units having never fired their guns in flight, never practiced formation flying, never engaged in mock combat. They were lambs to the slaughter. The shortage wasn't just fuel, it was experience, confidence, everything that makes a fighter pilot. The true measure of the Mustang's impact became clear on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history required absolute air superiority over the beaches. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe managed 319, losing 35 aircraft in the process. Over the actual invasion beaches, Only 2 German fighters appeared throughout the entire day. Oberst Josef Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches. With his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, he made a single strafing run on Sword Beach before being chased away by Spitfires. In his post-war memoir, Priller wrote, "2 planes. That's all we could manage against the greatest invasion in history. Not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked fuel, we lacked aircraft, and above all, we lacked air superiority. The Mustangs had taken that from us months before, not over Normandy, but over Berlin." Major Werner Schröer, who had commanded 3/JG-54 and claimed a P-51 on May 24, 1944, reflected on the strategic situation. "After the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we never regained the initiative. We were always reacting, always defending, always outnumbered. The Americans could strike anywhere at any time with fighter escort. We could barely defend our own airfields. The war in the air was lost the moment they could reach Berlin." In desperation, the Luftwaffe developed increasingly suicidal tactics. The Sturmgruppe, assault group concept, epitomized this desperation. FW-190A-8S were modified with additional armor plating, 30mm cannons, and reinforced windscreens. These flying tanks would bore straight through fighter screens to attack bombers at point-blank range. Major Walter Dahl, who had taken command of JG-300 on June 27, 1944, became the most famous proponent of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led IV Sturm, JG-3 with support from 2 Gruppen of Bf-109S from JG-300 in a massive assault against B-24 liberators near Leipzig. The heavily armoured FW-19s managed to destroy an entire squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group in less than a minute. But the cost was catastrophic. Of the Sturmgruppe fighters launched, 9 were shot down and 3 crash-landed. The escorting Bf-109s fared even worse against the Mustang escorts. The tactics that had worked briefly in July became increasingly suicidal as American fighter strength grew. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, one of the few Sturmgruppe pilots to survive multiple missions, described the reality. "We were flying coffins. The armour that was supposed to protect us made us so slow that the Mustangs could make multiple firing passes at leisure. The order was to ram if our guns jammed, but how could we ram when we couldn't even reach the bombers through the fighter screen? Each mission was Russian roulette with all chambers loaded. Germany's last hope lay in revolutionary technology, the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, Swallow, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of experienced pilots, it could have changed the air war. But the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. More critically, Hitler's insistence that it be used as a blitz bomber rather than a fighter interceptor wasted precious months. By the time significant numbers were available for fighter operations in late 1944, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel to train pilots in their operation and the airfields to operate them safely. Adolf Galland, who had been dismissed as General der Jagdflieger for his criticism of Hitler's policies, was given command of JV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945. Even with Germany's best surviving pilots flying the world's most advanced fighter, they could not overcome the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied forces. Galland himself described the futility. "We would take off, shoot down 1 or 2 bombers or fighters, and land to find our airfield under attack by Mustangs. They hunted us on the ground, catching Me-262s during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. For every minute we were in the air, Mustangs were overhead for an hour. Technology without numbers, fuel, and infrastructure is useless." By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was experiencing what historians would later call The death of the Experten. The veteran pilots who had scored dozens or even hundreds of victories were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The appearance of Mustangs deep inside Germany meant there was no safe space to train replacements, no quiet sector where novices could gain experience. The statistics tell a grim story. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots received 250 hours of flight training before combat. By 1944, this had been reduced to 80 hours. By early 1945, some pilots were sent into combat with as little as 20 hours in type. Meanwhile, American pilots arriving in England had 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in type and extensive gunnery training. Johannes Steinhoff, who would survive terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later reflected, "We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely fly formation were expected to engage Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It wasn't combat, it was murder." I stopped looking at the replacement pilots' faces. I knew most would be dead within a week. The loss rates confirm this assessment. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 7 missions. Some units experienced 100% turnover in a month. JG 301, once an elite unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945, while claiming only 41 victories. Lieutenant Günther Haase, who survived the war with 3 victories, provided a newly qualified pilot's perspective. "My first mission was supposed to be a training flight, a patrol over Brunswick with experienced pilots. We were bounced by Mustangs before we even formed up properly. My flight leader was killed in the first pass. I never saw the Mustang that shot at me, only the tracers passing my canopy. I dove to treetop level and flew home alone. That was my combat training." While the Luftwaffe bled in the skies, American bombing was relentlessly destroying German aircraft production. The Mustang's long range meant no factory was safe. The great production centres at Regensburg, Augsburg, Wiener Neustadt and Leipzig were hit repeatedly with devastating accuracy. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, testified after the war. "The Mustang allowed the Americans to maintain continuous pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a factory, resume production, and within days it would be destroyed again. We began dispersing production to caves and forests, but this increased costs and reduced efficiency by 75%. We were producing more fighters in 1944 than 1943, but we couldn't produce them fast enough to replace losses, and we had neither fuel to fly them nor pilots to fly them." The numbers bear this out. German fighter production peaked at 3,013 aircraft in September 1944, but losses that month were 3,217. The Luftwaffe was literally losing aircraft faster than the world's most efficient industrial economy could build them. Moreover, the quality of hastily assembled aircraft from dispersed facilities was declining. Engine failures, structural weaknesses, and system malfunctions plagued new aircraft. Oberingenieur Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, visited frontline units in December 1944 and was shocked by what he found. Aircraft were being delivered with critical defects. Engines that should run for 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces were jamming. Guns were misaligned. We had gone from producing the world's finest fighters to pushing out flying death traps. The workers were exhausted, the materials were substandard, and the testing was non-existent. We were sabotaging ourselves. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, baseplate, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. 900 fighters, virtually the entire remaining strength of the Luftwaffe in the West, took off at dawn. Many pilots were flying their first combat mission. Most had never flown in formations larger than 4 aircraft. The mission was so secret that German flak units weren't warned, resulting in devastating friendly fire incidents. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. 305 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground and 190 damaged. But the cost was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and, more critically, 213 pilots, including many irreplaceable experienced leaders. 3 Geschwader Commodore, 6 Gruppenkommandeure, and 14 Staffelkapitäne were killed or captured. Oberst Johann Kogler, who survived the mission, called it the Luftwaffe's death ride. We destroyed aircraft that the Americans replaced within a week. We lost pilots we could never replace. Worse, we burned our last reserves of fuel. After Bodenplatte, we were a spent force. We could no longer even pretend to contest the skies. The American response was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, Mustang sweeps were methodically hunting down the weakened German fighter units. Airfields were strafed repeatedly. In the week following Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, mostly destroyed on the ground. Major John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group, who claimed 24 aerial victories, described the post-Bodenplatte period. It was almost sad. We'd find German airfields packed with aircraft that couldn't fly for lack of fuel. We'd strafe them, they'd burn, and there would be no opposition. It wasn't combat anymore. It was execution. As 1945 progressed, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective force. Individual pilots still flew individual sorties, but coordinated operations were impossible. The appearance of Mustangs over any German airfield meant likely destruction. Pilots began refusing to fly, not from cowardice, but from the logical recognition that taking off meant certain death with no possibility of affecting the war's outcome. The psychological toll was devastating. Heinz Knoke, who had once written enthusiastically about defending the Reich, made his final published diary entry. "I have lost countless friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved like brothers, all dead. For what? We cannot even reach the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are everywhere. They own our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed." The Luftwaffe's own records, captured after the war, tell the story in stark numbers. January 1944, 2,395 fighter pilots available for operations. June 1944, 1,523 fighter pilots available, D-Day. January 1945, 742 fighter pilots available. April 1945, approximately 200 fighter pilots still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots who were operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war uninjured. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin had triggered a complete annihilation that consumed an entire generation of German aviators. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid about the impact of the P-51 Mustang. Their testimony, collected by Allied intelligence officers and later historians, provides unique insight into the psychological collapse of a once dominant force. Adolf Galland, despite his wartime dismissal and conflicts with Nazi leadership, remained one of the most respected voices on the Luftwaffe's defeat. In a 1954 interview, he stated, "The P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany. It wasn't the best fighter in every category. The Spitfire turned better, the FW-190 rolled better, the Me-262 was faster. But the Mustang was very good at everything and could fly anywhere. Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your opponent suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board." Johannes Steinhoff, who survived terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later served as Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee. His assessment was equally stark. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed the very concept of German air superiority. We had built our entire defensive strategy on the assumption that Germany proper was beyond the range of single-engine fighters. When that assumption proved false, everything collapsed. It wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe from which we never recovered. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Heinz Knoke, whose diary had chronicled the entire arc from confidence to collapse. In a 1975 reunion of former adversaries, he met Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, a triple ace who had flown Mustangs with the 357 fighter group. Knoke told him, "You must understand, when we saw your Mustangs over Berlin that first time, it was like discovering the ocean had no end. We had been told we were winning, that America was too far away to hurt us. Then suddenly you were there, over our capital, with fuel to spare. It broke something in us, not just our will to fight, but our faith in everything we had been told." Erich Hartmann, the war's highest-scoring ace with 352 victories, survived by developing specific anti-Mustang tactics. He would attack only when holding every advantage and would immediately disengage if Mustangs appeared. In his post-war interviews, he acknowledged, "Fighting Mustangs was not combat as we understood it. It was survival. They had every advantage: numbers, altitude, fuel, and increasingly pilot quality. We could only hope to survive and perhaps surprise a straggler." The statistical impact of the P-51 Mustang on the air war over Europe can be measured in stark numbers that reveal both the scale of American success and the completeness of German defeat. Aircraft-destroyed P-51 Mustangs claimed 4,950 aerial victories in Europe. Additional 4,131 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground. This represented 48.9% of all USAAF fighter claims in the European theatre. Loss ratios: P-51 combat loss rate, 1.2% per sortie. Luftwaffe fighter loss rate by 1945, 18% per sortie. Overall kill ratio, approximately 3.6 to 1 in favour of the P-51. Bomber protection, pre-Mustang bomber loss rate, 9.1% per mission. Post-Mustang bomber loss rate, 2.5% per mission. Reduction in bomber crew casualties, 68%. Range revolution, P-47. Thunderbolt combat radius, 375 miles. P-38, lightning combat radius, 450 miles. P-51B/C, Mustang combat radius, 650 miles, with drop tanks. P-51D Mustang combat radius, 750 miles, with drop tanks. Percentage of German territory within P-51 range, 100%. Production supremacy: total P-51s produced, 15,686. Peak production rate, 320 per month. Cost per aircraft, $51,000, $1945. German fighter production, 1944, 25,860. German fighters operational at any time, never more than 1,500. Pilot attrition. American pilots arriving in Europe 1944 to 45, average 400 hours flight time. German pilots entering combat 1944 to 45, average 80 hours flight time. Luftwaffe pilot survival rate 1944 to 45, less than 15%. American fighter pilot tour completion rate 65%. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic revolution in air warfare. For the first time in history, one nation could project decisive air power over the entirety of another major power's territory. The implications extended far beyond World War II. General Karl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, wrote in his after-action report, "The P-51 Mustang gave us air supremacy over Europe, not air superiority, which implies a continuing contest, but air supremacy, total domination. By spring 1944, we could strike any target at any time with acceptable losses. This was not just a military advantage, but a psychological weapon. German morale, both military and civilian, collapsed when they realized we could reach anywhere, anytime. The Mustang enabled a cascade of strategic effects, industrial paralysis. No German factory was safe. Production had to be dispersed to inefficient hidden facilities. Transportation networks were constantly severed. The German economy, already strained, began complete collapse. Fuel crisis acceleration. Synthetic fuel plants, previously unreachable, were destroyed methodically. This created a death spiral. Less fuel meant less pilot training, which meant higher combat losses, which meant even less fuel could be allocated to training. Tactical air supremacy. With the Luftwaffe driven from the skies, Allied ground forces could operate with impunity. The breakout from Normandy, the race across France, the crossing of the Rhine, all were possible because German forces could move only at night. Psychological collapse. The appearance of American fighters over the Reich's capital shattered the myth of German invincibility. Civilians who had been told America was weak and far away watched silver Mustangs circle overhead unopposed. Germany had actually begun the war with technological advantages in many areas. The Bf-109 was arguably the world's best fighter in 1939. German pilots were superbly trained, with many having combat experience from the Spanish Civil War. German tactics, particularly the Finger Four formation and energy fighting techniques, were revolutionary. But the Mustang represented something different: the marriage of British innovation, the Merlin engine, American mass production, built by North, American aviation using automobile industry techniques, and continuous improvement based on combat experience. It was not the product of a single genius designer, but of collaborative refinement. The P-51D, which began arriving in May 1944, incorporated numerous improvements based on combat experience. The bubble canopy provided 360-degree visibility, 6.50 caliber machine guns with improved ammunition feed, the K-14 computing gun sight, strengthened wings for additional ordnance, improved radio equipment, the Packard 5 1650-7 engine producing 1,590 horsepower. Each improvement addressed specific combat needs identified by pilots. This feedback loop, combat experience driving rapid design improvement, driving better combat performance, was something the German system, with its chaotic leadership and disrupted production, could not match. Dr. Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, admitted after the war, "We could design aircraft equal to or better than the Mustang." The TA-152H was superior in many ways, but we could not produce them in quantity, could not fuel them consistently, and could not train pilots to fly them effectively. The Americans didn't just build a better fighter, they built a better system for designing, producing, and employing fighters. The German response to the Mustang revealed the fundamental flaws in the Nazi system. Instead of acknowledging the threat and adapting, they denied reality. Instead of concentrating on fighters, Hitler demanded bomber production. Instead of preserving their experienced pilots as instructors, they flew them until they died. Instead of admitting strategic miscalculation, they court-martialed pilots who reported the truth. The impact on Germany's celebrated aces was particularly telling. These were men who had scored dozens, sometimes hundreds of victories. They were not just pilots but symbols of German martial prowess. The Mustang era saw their elimination one by one. Major Klaus Mitusch, 72 victories, was killed by P-51s on September 17, 1944. He had survived 452 combat missions, only to be bounced by Mustangs while forming up for an attack. Oberst Walter Oesaw, 123 victories, was shot down by P-38s on May 11, 1944. Even the older American fighters were becoming lethal as German pilot quality declined. Major Hans Philipp, 206 victories, shot down by P-47s on October 8, 1943, before the Mustang's arrival in force, but his death presaged what was coming. The list continues: a roll call of Germany's finest pilots eliminated one by one. By war's end, of the 107 German pilots who had achieved 100 or more victories, 95 were dead, seriously wounded or captured. The Mustang hadn't just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had annihilated its institutional memory. As 1945 began, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in reality. Aircraft were hidden in forests, camouflaged on fake farmland, or dispersed to highway strips. Pilots lived like hunted animals, moving constantly to avoid the omnipresent Mustangs. Oberst Gordon Golob, one of the few senior commanders still alive, issued orders that revealed the desperation. Aircraft will take off only when enemy bombers are directly overhead. Maximum sortie duration 15 minutes. Any pilot airborne longer than 20 minutes will be presumed to have defected. The fear of Mustangs had become so pervasive that many pilots would abort missions at the first report of escort fighters. Courts-martial for cowardice became common, though executing experienced pilots when so few remained was counterproductive. Morale collapsed entirely when pilots realized that even successful missions achieved nothing. The bombers kept coming, the Mustangs kept escorting them, and Germany kept dying. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, with 99 victories, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944, one victory short of becoming a century ace. His wingman reported, 6 Mustangs. They came from above and behind. Heinrich never had a chance. They followed him down, firing continuously. Even after his aircraft was burning, they kept shooting. They wanted to make sure. This ruthlessness was new. Earlier in the war, there had been a degree of chivalry. Pilots who bailed out were generally not attacked. Damaged aircraft trying to withdraw were sometimes allowed to escape. But by 1945, American pilots had seen too many friends die, knew the war's end was near, and wanted to ensure the Luftwaffe could never recover. Every German pilot killed was one who couldn't fly the jets or advanced fighters Germany was still trying to develop. American Mustang pilots were remarkably consistent in their assessment of the campaign's progression. Colonel John C. Meyer, who scored 24 aerial victories, provided this analysis. From March to June 1944, we fought the Luftwaffe's first team, experienced, aggressive, skilled. From June to December, we faced their second line, still dangerous but less coordinated. By 1945, we were shooting down students, kids who could barely fly formation, let alone fight. It wasn't satisfying. It was necessary but tragic. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, commanding the 362nd Fighter Squadron, observed, "The Mustang didn't just give us range, it gave us psychological dominance. German pilots knew that if they saw Mustangs, they were probably going to die. We could see it in their tactics. Early on, they'd attack aggressively even when outnumbered. By late 44, they'd run at the first sight of us. By 45, many wouldn't even take off if Mustangs were reported in the area." Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, scored 11.5 victories in Mustangs. His assessment was characteristically direct. The P-51 was an honest airplane. It told you what it was going to do. It had no vices if you treated it right. Against German fighters in 44 and 45, it was like having a rifle when they had muskets. We had every advantage: speed, range, altitude, and numbers. It wasn't a fair fight, but war isn't supposed to be fair. Perhaps the most telling testimony came from bomber crews whose lives depended on fighter escort. Technical Sergeant William McManus, a B-17 gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, recalled, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like suicide. We'd watch our escort turn back and know the wolves were coming. After March 44, seeing those Mustangs with us all the way to target and back, it was like having guardian angels. Our loss rate went from probably going to die to probably going to make it home." The P-51's success was not just a triumph of design, but of production. North American Aviation's plants in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, achieved production rates that seemed impossible by German standards. At peak production in 1944, North American was completing one Mustang every 63 minutes. The assembly line, adapted from automobile manufacturing, broke construction into specialized stations. Workers became experts at single tasks, achieving speeds and precision impossible with traditional aircraft manufacturing methods. Paul Peters, a production supervisor at Inglewood, described the system. We had housewives installing control cables, teenagers riveting wing panels, men too old for the draft assembling engines. None of them had built an airplane before the war, but the system was so well designed that within weeks they were producing perfect work. We had quality control at every station. If something wasn't right, the line stopped until it was fixed. The contrast with German production was stark. As Allied bombing forced dispersal, German aircraft were being assembled in caves, forests, and abandoned mines. Different components might be manufactured hundreds of miles apart. Quality control was impossible. Workers were often slave labourers who had every incentive to sabotage production. Oberst Dietrich Hrabak, who commanded various fighter units throughout the war, observed, "We would receive new aircraft that looked perfect but were flying coffins. Control cables installed incorrectly, fuel lines that leaked, guns that wouldn't fire. The Americans were building better aircraft in greater numbers with workers who wanted to win. We were building inferior aircraft in smaller numbers with workers who wanted us to lose." The success of the P-51 over Berlin had implications far beyond the European theatre. It demonstrated that air power could be projected globally, that distance was no longer a barrier to American reach. This lesson was not lost on Japan, which watched its defensive perimeter shrink as American long-range fighters enabled bombing campaigns against the home islands. Stalin, too, took notice. Soviet pilots who flew Lend-Lease P-51s were impressed by their range and reliability. The Soviet Air Force began developing long-range escort fighters, understanding that future conflicts would require power projection over vast distances. The VVS, Soviet Air Force, received 10 P-51s and tested them extensively, though they were never used in combat by Soviet forces. The Mustang continued serving long after World War II ended. In Korea, F-51s, the designation changed in 1948, flew close support missions. The Israeli Air Force used Mustangs in the 1956 Suez Crisis. Various air forces flew Mustangs into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force retired their last F-51D in 1984, 40 years after it first flew over Berlin. But the Mustang's greatest legacy was doctrinal. It proved that air superiority was not just about controlling airspace over the battlefield, but about controlling airspace over entire nations. Every modern air force builds its strategy around this lesson, first demonstrated when American fighters appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses were human beings, young men, mostly in their early 20s, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin meant different things to different people, but for all it was a moment of profound realization. For American pilots, it was vindication. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote home, "We flew over Hitler's capital today. Think about that. We took off from England, flew across all of Germany, circled Berlin like we owned it, because we did, and flew home." 2 years ago, the Nazis were bombing London. Today, we own the sky over Berlin. It's hard to describe the feeling, pride, power, and the absolute certainty that we're going to win this war. For German pilots, it was despair. Feldwebel Rudi Müller of JG 302 wrote to his wife, "I saw them today, American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters. It's impossible, but I saw them with my own eyes. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. There is no safe place left in Germany. How do I tell you that I don't expect to survive this? How do I explain that everything we believed was wrong?" For German civilians, it was the beginning of the end of illusion. Berliner Ursula von Kardorff wrote in her diary, "We were told the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled society could never match German strength." Today I watched American fighters circle overhead while our vaunted Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Everything they told us was lies. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? For Allied bomber crews, it was salvation. Staff Sergeant James McMahon, ball turret gunner on B-17 Lucky Lady, recalled, "Seeing those Mustangs form up on us as we approached Berlin, I'm not ashamed to say I cried. For the first time since I started flying missions, I thought I might actually survive this war. Those little friends with the big range saved thousands of us." As the war ended, the full magnitude of what the Mustang had achieved became clear. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the war as arguably the world's most powerful air force, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The statistics are staggering. Total Luftwaffe aircraft lost 1944 to 45, approximately 45,000. Luftwaffe pilots killed 1944 to 45, approximately 15,000. Percentage of Luftwaffe pilots operational in January 1944 who survived the war uninjured, less than 5%. German cities destroyed by bombing, 61, over 50% destruction. German civilian casualties from bombing, 350,000 to 500,000. German industrial production lost to bombing, 35 to 40%. These numbers represent not just military defeat, but societal collapse. The Mustang had enabled a campaign that brought war to every German city, every factory, every airfield. There was no rear area, no safe haven, no respite. Hermann Göring, on trial at Nuremberg, was asked when he knew Germany had lost the war. His answer became one of the most quoted statements of the conflict. "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything after that was just delay, just more dead young men for no purpose." It was a remarkably candid admission from a man not known for honesty. But even Göring, master of denial and delusion, could not deny what the Mustang represented. American industrial power married to British innovation, projected across impossible distances with ruthless efficiency. The P-51's development from initial concept to Berlin escort fighter represents one of the most rapid and successful aircraft development programs in history. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, just 102 days after North American aviation received the British Purchasing Commission's request. By March 1944, less than 4 years later, it was escorting bombers to Berlin. This speed of development was matched by continuous improvement based on combat experience. Each version incorporated lessons learned. P-51. A. Allison engine, limited high-altitude performance. P-51 B/C, Packard Merlin, Fe-1650-3 engine, transformed performance above 20,000 feet. P-51D, bubble canopy, 6 guns, improved systems, V-1650-7 engine. P-51H, lightened structure, peak performance, never saw combat in Europe. The feedback loop, combat experience driving rapid design improvement, was something the German system, with its chaotic leadership and disrupted production, could not match. While German engineers produced technically excellent designs like the TAR-152H or Me-262, they couldn't refine them based on combat experience or produce them in meaningful numbers. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin validated the entire American strategic bombing concept. Pre-war theorists like Billy Mitchell and Julio Duhay had argued that bombing could win wars by destroying enemy industry and morale. But until long-range escort was available, this remained theory. The Mustang made precision daylight bombing possible. While the British continued area bombing at night, Americans could now put bombs precisely on specific facilities. ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft assembly buildings. The accuracy difference was dramatic. British night bombing achieved an average circular error of 3 miles. American daylight bombing with fighter escort achieved 1,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, who would later lead Strategic Air Command, stated, "The P-51 made strategic bombing work. Without it, we would have had to accept either unsustainable losses or ineffective night bombing. With it, we could methodically destroy specific target sets. We didn't just bomb Germany. We performed industrial surgery, removing their ability to make war." The results spoke for themselves. German ball-bearing production reduced 70%. Aviation fuel production reduced 95%. Synthetic rubber production reduced 85%. Railroad traffic reduced 75%. Canal traffic eliminated entirely in Western Germany. This precise application of force, made possible by Mustang escorts, shortened the war by months or possibly years. Every factory destroyed, every rail line cut, every fuel depot burned, meant German forces couldn't fight effectively. The image of Mustangs over Berlin became one of the iconic visuals of World War II, ranking with the flag raising on Iwo Jima, or Soviet soldiers at the Reichstag. It represented American power projection, technological superiority, and the certainty of Allied victory. For Americans, the Mustang became a symbol of their nation's industrial and technological prowess. It was featured in war bond posters, Hollywood films, and post-war celebrations. The fact that it was designed and built in record time by a company that had never produced a fighter before embodied the American can-do spirit. For Germans, the Mustang represented humiliation and defeat. Post-war German literature and films often feature the image of American fighters over German cities as a symbol of the regime's failure to protect its people. The trauma of being unable to defend one's own airspace left lasting psychological scars on the Luftwaffe veterans who survived. Heinz Knoke, writing in 1953, reflected, "For a fighter pilot, the ultimate duty is to protect your homeland's skies. We failed. The Mustangs over Berlin were proof of our failure visible to every German who looked up. That shame never fully goes away." Military academies worldwide still study the Mustang's impact on the European air war as a case study in how technology can create strategic revolution. The lessons are timeless. Range equals options. The ability to project power at distance provides strategic flexibility. The Mustang gave Allied commanders options the Germans couldn't counter. Integration beats isolation. The Mustang succeeded not alone, but as part of an integrated system: bombers, fighters, intelligence, logistics, training. The Germans had excellent individual components, but couldn't integrate them effectively. Production wins wars. Building vast numbers of good aircraft beats small numbers of excellent aircraft. The Mustang was excellent, but more importantly, there were thousands of them. Pilot quality matters. Technology without trained operators is useless. American pilot training programs, with their emphasis on flight hours and realistic combat training, produced pilots who could exploit the Mustang's capabilities fully. Adaptation is survival. The Americans continuously improved tactics, technology, and training based on combat experience. The Germans, hidebound by rigid doctrine and political interference, couldn't adapt quickly enough. Modern air forces apply these lessons daily. The emphasis on long-range strike capability, integrated air defense systems, pilot training, and industrial base preservation all stem from lessons learned when Mustangs first appeared over Berlin. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, marked more than a tactical milestone. It was the moment Nazi Germany's fundamental assumptions about the war collapsed. The Reich was supposed to be a fortress, protected by distance, defended by the world's best pilots flying the world's best fighters. The Mustang shattered these illusions in a single morning. For the German leadership, military and political, It was a moment of terrible clarity. They had based their entire strategy on the Americans being unable to project power across the Atlantic effectively. They had dismissed American industrial capacity as inefficient, American technology as inferior, American pilots as soft. Every assumption was wrong, and the Mustangs over Berlin were proof that couldn't be denied, propagandized away, or ignored. Adolf Galland would later write, "March 6, 1944 was the day we lost the war. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler died, but when American fighters appeared over our capital. Everything after was just the playing out of a foregone conclusion." The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it proved that American industrial democracy could outproduce, out-innovate, and outfight Nazi totalitarianism. The psychological impact rippled through German society. If the regime couldn't protect Berlin from American fighters, what could it do? If everything they'd been told about American weakness was false, what else was false? The Mustang became an unwitting agent of truth, its presence over German cities proof that the Nazi worldview was built on lies. While the Mustang's success was decisive, it came at a cost. 2,520 P-51s were lost in combat in the European theatre. Behind each loss was a young man who would never come home. The 357th Fighter Group alone lost over 100 pilots killed in action. These were the best America had to offer: college students, athletes, young professionals who volunteered to fly and fight. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, was killed on March 31, 1944, when his P-51B was hit by flak near Brunswick. He was 28 years old, married with 2 children he would never see grow up. His loss was replicated thousands of times, young men who paid the ultimate price for the strategic victory the Mustang achieved. Captain Don Gentile, one of the war's top Mustang aces with 21.83 aerial victories, survived combat only to die in a flying accident in January 1951, testing a T-33 jet trainer. The war's echoes continued long after the shooting stopped. Many Mustang pilots struggled with what they had seen and done, carrying psychological wounds that never fully healed. But their sacrifice achieved something remarkable. They had taken the war to the enemy's homeland, forced the enemy to fight over his own territory, and won decisively. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin. From that day forward, it was a broken force, capable only of sporadic, ineffective resistance. As dawn broke on May 8, 1945, VE Day, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany. There was no opposition. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized Europe, that had seemed invincible in 1940, no longer existed. Its aircraft were destroyed or grounded for lack of fuel. Its pilots were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Its infrastructure was rubble. The transformation from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, represents one of the most complete military victories in history. The P-51 Mustang had been the instrument of that victory, the tool that turned Allied air power from a costly liability into an irresistible force. In those 14 months, Mustang pilots had flown over 213,000 sorties, claimed 4,950 aerial victories, destroyed 4,131 aircraft on the ground, dropped 31,000 tons of bombs, fired 99 million rounds of ammunition. Behind these statistics was a human reality. Young American men, average age 22, flying aluminum aircraft powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, had comprehensively destroyed one of history's most formidable air forces. They had done it not through individual heroics, though there was plenty of that, but through superior technology, training, tactics, and industrial support. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, one of the war's most successful fighter commanders, provided perhaps the best epitaph for the Luftwaffe. They were magnificent opponents who were simply overwhelmed. We had more of everything, More planes, more fuel, more pilots, more training, more range. The Mustang gave us the ability to apply that more anywhere we chose. Once we could escort to Berlin, the mathematics of victory became inevitable. When Major Hans Kogler saw those first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, he witnessed more than enemy fighters. He witnessed the future of air warfare. The P-51 Mustang had proven that technology could overcome distance, that industrial capacity could triumph over individual skill, that methodical approach could defeat improvised brilliance. The shocked German pilots who encountered Mustangs over Berlin were not just facing a superior aircraft, they were facing the combined industrial, technological, and organizational power of the United States projected across an ocean and deep into the heart of their homeland. It was a demonstration of force that shattered every assumption about what was possible in aerial warfare. Hermann Göring's admission about knowing the war was lost when he saw American fighters over Berlin has become one of history's most telling acknowledgments of defeat. But the full significance of that moment extends beyond one man's realization or even one nation's defeat. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself. The moment when air power became truly strategic, when industrial capacity became more important than warrior tradition, when organized efficiency triumphed over individual heroism. The German pilots who were shocked by Mustangs over Berlin had witnessed something that would echo through the decades. The projection of American power across vast distances with precision and overwhelming force. Every modern military intervention from Korea to Kosovo, from Vietnam to the Gulf War, has built upon the foundation laid when those first Mustangs appeared in the skies over Brandenburg. In the final analysis, the P-51 Mustang did more than escort bombers or shoot down German fighters. It shattered the last illusions of a regime built on lies about racial superiority and national destiny. It proved that free societies, despite their apparent chaos and inefficiency, could organize, innovate, and project power more effectively than totalitarian states. It demonstrated that technology and industry, properly applied, could overcome any defensive advantage of geography or position. The Luftwaffe pilots who looked up in shock at those silver Mustangs on March 6, 1944, were witnessing their own obsolescence. Within 14 months, their entire force would be destroyed, their nation occupied, their ideology discredited. The shock of seeing impossible American fighters over Berlin was the beginning of a cascade of revelations that would end with Germany's complete defeat and transformation. Today, preserved P-51 Mustangs still fly at airshows, their distinctive Merlin engines producing a sound that veterans of that era recognize instantly. For American veterans, it's the sound of victory. For German veterans, it's the sound that announced the beginning of the end. For historians, it's the sound that changed warfare forever. The moment when one nation proved it could project decisive air power anywhere on Earth. The story of Luftwaffe pilots shocked by P-51 Mustangs over Berlin is ultimately a story about the collision between assumption and reality, between propaganda and truth, between what was thought impossible and what American industry made routine. When those Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they didn't just shock the Luftwaffe pilots who saw them. They shocked an entire worldview into extinction. But from that wreckage would rise something new. Many of the German pilots who survived the shock of Mustangs over Berlin would help build the post-war Luftwaffe of democratic Germany, allied with the very nation whose fighters had destroyed their comrades. Johannes Steinhoff would rise to become Chief of Staff of the new German Air Force and eventually chairman of the NATO Military Committee. In 1983, he would stand beside American generals who had flown Mustangs against him, united in defense of the freedom that his former enemies had brought to his defeated nation. This transformation, from mortal enemies to steadfast allies, was perhaps the most profound shock of all. The Mustangs that had appeared over Berlin hadn't just brought destruction, they had ultimately brought liberation. The German pilots, who had been shocked by their appearance in 1944, would, in time, come to understand that those American fighters had freed them from a criminal regime that had led them to disaster. The last word belongs to Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, who had denied, then witnessed, then survived the Mustang onslaught. In 1984, at a reunion of American and German fighter pilots in San Antonio, Texas, he raised a glass to his former enemies and said, "You shocked us when your Mustangs appeared over Berlin. You shocked us with your industry, your technology, your determination. But the greatest shock came after the war, when you helped us rebuild, when you protected us from Soviet aggression, when you became our friends. The Mustangs over Berlin didn't just end a war, they began a peace. For that, we who survived are forever grateful." The circle was complete. The shock that had begun with Hans Kogler's horrified recognition of American fighters over Brandenburg had transformed, through defeat and reconstruction, into partnership and friendship. The Mustangs had indeed changed the sky forever, not just the sky over Berlin on March 6, 1944, but the strategic sky under which all nations have operated ever since. In that transformation lies the true legacy of the P-51 Mustang, not just as an instrument of victory, but as a catalyst for the post-war world order that followed. The shocked Luftwaffe pilots of March 1944 could never have imagined that the American fighters destroying their force would ultimately lead to their nation's redemption and integration into a community of democratic nations. Yet that is exactly what happened. The Mustangs that shocked the Luftwaffe over Berlin didn't just win a war. They helped win a peace that has endured for 8 decades. In the end, that may be their greatest victory of all.